It was just past 11 o'clock on the night of March 24, 2022, and Icon Park in Orlando, Florida, was still bustling with visitors enjoying the spring evening. The entertainment complex, located in the heart of Orlando's tourist district along International Drive, featured restaurants, shops, and several attractions including the massive Orlando Eye Ferris wheel and two towering thrill rides that dominated the skyline. Families wandered between attractions, teenagers posed for photos, and thrill seekers lined up for the park's signature rides. The temperature was pleasant, around 70 degrees, typical for late March in Central Florida. Among the crowd was Tyre Sampson, a 14-year-old boy from Missouri visiting Orlando with his football team and coaches as a reward for their successful season. Tyre was excited, looking forward to experiencing Orlando's famous attractions, particularly the thrill rides he'd seen in videos online. He stood 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 383 pounds, a large teenager who played football as a lineman, using his size to his advantage on the field. Tonight he wanted to experience the Orlando FreeFall, advertised as the world's tallest freestanding drop tower, a ride that would take passengers 430 feet into the air before releasing them in a heart-stopping freefall back to Earth. Everything seemed normal, just another busy night at a popular Orlando attraction, where thousands of visitors came to experience controlled fear and manufactured thrills. The Orlando FreeFall had opened just 4 months earlier in December 2021, the newest addition to Icon Park, and a major investment intended to attract thrill seekers to the complex. The ride was manufactured by Funtime, an Austrian company with decades of experience building drop towers and other amusement rides. Standing 430 feet tall, the FreeFall was indeed the world's tallest freestanding drop tower, a distinction the park marketed aggressively. The ride consisted of a central tower, with a ring of 30 seats arranged in a circle, facing outward so riders would have unobstructed views during their ascent and fall. The seats were equipped with shoulder harnesses, over-the-shoulder restraints that were supposed to secure riders safely in their seats during the extreme forces of the drop. The ride's operation was straightforward in concept. Passengers would board at ground level, be secured in their seats, then the ring of seats would slowly climb the tower while riders took in panoramic views of Orlando spreading out below them. Upon reaching the top, the seats would pause briefly, then release, allowing gravity to pull the seats into freefall for several seconds before magnetic brakes gradually slowed the descent over the final 100 feet. The sensation was meant to simulate skydiving or base jumping, providing an adrenaline rush in a controlled, supposedly safe environment. What made drop tower rides particularly thrilling and potentially dangerous was the extreme forces involved. During freefall, riders experienced near weightlessness, floating in their seats with only the restraints holding them in place. As the magnetic brakes engage, deceleration forces can reach 3 or 4 times the force of gravity, pressing riders down into their seats with tremendous force. These forces meant that restraints had to be engineered carefully, tight enough to prevent riders from lifting out during weightlessness, but also able to withstand the loads during deceleration without injuring riders. Manufacturers spent years designing and testing restraint systems, conducting engineering analysis, building prototypes, and testing with weighted dummies representing various body types. The designs that emerged were the result of careful engineering, balancing safety, comfort, and the practical reality that passengers come in many different sizes and shapes. The Funtime seat design used on Orlando FreeFall featured an over-the-shoulder harness that lowered from above, resting on the rider's shoulders and chest, with the harness locking at multiple positions to accommodate riders of different heights and sizes. The critical safety feature was the locking mechanism that prevented the harness from opening during the ride. The harness locked using a ratchet system with multiple notches, allowing operators to secure it at different positions. Sensors detected whether the harness was locked in a position that met minimum safety requirements. The manufacturer's specifications were explicit and non-negotiable. The harness had to be locked within a certain range to ensure rider safety, not too loose, or the rider could slip out, not too tight, or it could cause injury or discomfort. Additionally, the ride had a maximum weight limit of 287 pounds, chosen because testing had shown that heavier riders might not be adequately secured by the restraint system design. At some point between the ride's opening in December 2021 and March 2022, someone made modifications to the Orlando FreeFall seats that would prove catastrophic. The sensors that detected whether the harness was properly positioned were adjusted, allowing the harness to lock in positions that were looser than the manufacturer's specifications permitted. Specifically, The sensors were adjusted to allow the harness to lock 2 to 3 inches higher than design specifications required. This modification was not documented in maintenance records, was not approved by the manufacturer, and violated every principle of amusement ride safety. Why this modification was made became a central question in the subsequent investigation. The most likely explanation, and the one supported by operational patterns, was that operators were allowing riders who exceeded the ride specifications to board, and the original sensor settings prevented the harness from securing properly for these oversized riders. Rather than turning away paying customers, someone decided to adjust the sensors, allowing the harness to lock in positions that accommodated larger riders but provided inadequate safety margins. This decision, made by someone whose identity was never definitively established, but who almost certainly worked for or was contracted by the slingshot group that operated the ride, set up an invisible catastrophe waiting to happen. The modified sensors meant the ride's safety systems were lying, indicating that riders were safely secured when in fact the restraints were dangerously loose. Operators checking the harnesses before dispatch would see green lights indicating proper lockup, even when riders were not actually secure. The modification was invisible to casual observation. The ride looked normal, operated normally, and gave no indication that its safety systems had been compromised. Hundreds or possibly thousands of riders had ridden with the modified sensors in the months before March 24, many of them likely secured improperly without incident because they were small enough or light enough that even the loosened restraints held them adequately. But statistics and probability catch up eventually. Every ride with improperly secured passengers was a gamble, and eventually, the combination of factors that would cause the restraint to fail completely would occur. On the evening of March 24, Tyre Sampson approached the Orlando FreeFall with a group that included other football players and their coaches. Tyre was excited but also slightly apprehensive. At 383 pounds, he was well aware that he was larger than most people his age, and he'd had experiences at other amusement parks where rides couldn't accommodate him safely. When he approached the loading platform, he should have been told immediately that he exceeded the ride's weight limit by nearly 100 pounds and could not ride. There should have been a scale at the entrance where riders were weighed, or at minimum, operators should have been trained to assess whether riders appeared to exceed weight limits and ask them to step on a scale if there was doubt. Neither of these safety protocols was in place or being followed at Orlando FreeFall that night. Tyre boarded the ride and sat in his assigned seat. The ride operator lowered the shoulder harness. Immediately there was a problem that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. The harness did not secure properly against Tyre's body. Because of his size, specifically his broad chest and shoulders, the harness could not lower to the position where it would adequately restrain him. A properly functioning sensor system would have prevented the ride from operating, triggering a fault that would require the operator to reposition the rider or remove them from the ride. But the modified sensors indicated that the harness was locked in an acceptable position when in fact it was dangerously loose, with a gap of several inches between the restraint and Tyre's body. Video footage from other riders' phones, which would later become crucial evidence, shows Tyre's harness sitting noticeably higher and looser than the harnesses on adjacent riders. He appears uncomfortable and concerned, fidgeting with the restraint and looking around as if seeking reassurance or help. According to witness statements, Tyre expressed concern to the operators before the ride began. He asked if he was secure, told them the harness felt loose, questioned whether it was safe. The exact words varied in different accounts, but multiple witnesses reported hearing Tyre voice concerns and seeing operators dismiss those concerns, telling him he was fine, that the ride was safe, that he should relax and enjoy it. The operators checked the control panel, saw green lights indicating all restraints were locked, and apparently concluded that everything was fine. They did not manually test Tyre's restraint by pulling on it forcefully to verify it wouldn't release. They did not compare his restraint position to manufacturer specifications. They did not have him step off the ride, so they could investigate why he felt insecure. They dismissed his concerns, relying on faulty sensor readings from a system they had or someone else had deliberately compromised. The ride began its ascent. The 30 seats arranged in a circle around the central tower slowly climbed into the night sky. Orlando spread out below them, a carpet of lights extending in every direction, the distinctive shapes of theme park attractions visible in the distance. For most riders, the slow climb was part of the thrill, anticipation building as they rose higher and higher, knowing that at the top they would be released into freefall. For Tyre, the ascent must have been terrifying in a way the ride designers never intended. He could feel the restraint sitting loose against his body. He could feel himself not fully secured in the seat. As the ride climbed and air resistance increased, he may have felt the harness shifting, the inadequate restraint unable to hold him firmly in place. The seats reached the top of the tower, 430 feet above the ground, and paused. For a few seconds, riders sat suspended in the air, taking in the view, some screaming in anticipation or fear, others laughing nervously. Then the release mechanism activated. The seats dropped into freefall. For 3 or 4 seconds, the seats fell freely, accelerating toward terminal velocity, riders experiencing near weightlessness as they plummeted toward the ground. During those seconds of weightlessness, when riders should have been held in place by their restraints, Tyre's grossly inadequate harness failed to do its job. His body, weighing 383 pounds, and experiencing weightlessness, lifted from the seat. The loose harness, which had never properly secured him, allowed his body to rise up and begin to slip through the opening. What happened next was captured on video by other riders holding phones, footage that would go viral and shock the world. As the seats began to decelerate and the magnetic brakes engaged, creating strong downward forces that pressed most riders into their seats, Tyre was no longer in his seat. He was partially out of the harness, his body having risen during weightlessness and now being pulled by gravity and the deceleration forces. Other riders can be heard screaming, though it's unclear if they were screaming in normal excitement or because they had seen Tyre slipping out. The forces pulling on his body overcame whatever minimal hold the loose harness had. Tyre slipped completely free of the restraint. He fell from a height estimated at between 70 and 80 feet as the seats descended past that point on the tower. At that height, falling onto concrete or pavement is almost certainly fatal. The human body cannot withstand the deceleration forces involved in such a fall. Tyre struck the ground at a speed exceeding 60 miles per hour. The impact killed him almost instantly, causing massive trauma that no medical intervention could have overcome. The ride continued its descent with an empty seat, the restraint that should have held him hanging open, evidence of the catastrophic safety failure visible to everyone as the seats reached ground level. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Riders who had been on the ride with Tyre, some of whom had seen him fall, were traumatized and screaming. Park guests who witnessed the fall, or saw the aftermath, were in shock. Someone called 911 immediately. Orange County Fire Rescue and Orlando Police responded within minutes. Paramedics found Tyre unresponsive and began resuscitation attempts, but his injuries were incompatible with life. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The park was evacuated. The Orlando FreeFall and the adjacent Orlando Slingshot ride were immediately shut down. Police secured the scene as a potential crime scene, recognizing that this was not merely a tragic accident, but potentially involved criminal negligence or worse. The notification of Tyre's family was devastating. His mother, Nekia Dodd, and father Yarnell Sampson, learned that their son had died in what should have been a fun, safe activity during a reward trip with his football team. The pain of losing a child is unimaginable under any circumstances, but losing him in such a violent, preventable way, while he was supposed to be having fun, created a grief that would never fully heal. They had sent their son on a trip expecting him to make memories and bond with teammates. Instead, they received a call no parent should ever receive. The investigation began immediately, with multiple agencies involved. The Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, which oversees amusement ride safety in Florida, took the lead on the technical investigation. The Orange County Sheriff's Office investigated potential criminal violations. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration examined workplace safety issues. The manufacturer, Funtime, sent representatives to inspect the ride and review maintenance records. What investigators discovered was a pattern of negligence, corner cutting, and safety violations that had created a death trap while presenting the appearance of a properly maintained attraction. The modified sensors were discovered quickly. Technicians comparing the sensor positions to manufacturer specifications immediately identified that they had been adjusted far outside acceptable parameters. The adjustment was not subtle or accidental. Someone had deliberately modified safety-critical systems to allow the ride to operate outside design specifications. Investigators documented the modification with photographs and measurements, preserving evidence that would become crucial in subsequent legal proceedings. Maintenance records were reviewed and found to be inadequate. The ride had only been operating for 4 months, but already there were gaps in required documentation. Daily inspection checklists were incomplete or appeared to have been filled out perfunctorily without actual inspection being performed. There was no record of who had modified the sensors or when, suggesting the modification had been done without proper documentation and authorization. Training records for operators were reviewed and found deficient, with operators not properly trained on weight limits, restraint verification procedures, or how to respond to rider concerns. The weight limit violation was egregious and undeniable. Tyre weighed 383 pounds in a ride with a 287-pound maximum weight limit. He exceeded the limit by 96 pounds, more than 30% over the maximum. There was no scale at the ride entrance. Operators had no procedure for estimating rider weights. There was no posted signage clearly stating the weight limit where riders would see it before boarding. The weight limit was mentioned in some of the ride's documentation, but not prominently displayed or enforced. This wasn't an oversight. Weight limits on thrill rides exist because manufacturers have determined through engineering analysis and testing that heavier riders cannot be safely secured or that the forces involved exceed safe limits for heavier bodies. Ignoring weight limits isn't about being inclusive or avoiding discrimination. It's about physics and safety margins that cannot be negotiated or ignored without potentially fatal consequences. Witness statements painted a damning picture of operator negligence. Multiple witnesses reported hearing Tyre express concerns about his restraint and seeing operators dismiss those concerns. Some witnesses reported that operators appeared rushed or inattentive during the loading process. Other riders reported that operators had not manually checked restraints by pulling on them, relying entirely on sensor readings. The operators working that night were interviewed extensively. Their statements were somewhat contradictory, with some claiming they had checked Tyre's restraint and found it acceptable, while others admitted they had primarily relied on the control panel indicators. None could explain why they had allowed a rider who so obviously exceeded the weight limit to board the ride. The legal consequences came swiftly. The Slingshot Group, which operated the Orlando FreeFall and Slingshot rides at Icon Park, faced immediate scrutiny. The rides were closed pending investigation. Florida's Department of Agriculture issued emergency orders prohibiting operation. Icon Park, as the property owner and overall operator of the complex, cooperated with investigators, but also faced questions about their oversight of tenant operators. Within days it became clear that the rides would not reopen, at least not under current ownership and management. Civil lawsuits were filed almost immediately. Tyre's parents, represented by prominent personal injury attorneys including Ben Crump, filed wrongful death suits against the Slingshot Group, Icon Park, the ride manufacturer Funtime, and other parties potentially liable. The lawsuits alleged gross negligence, failure to follow safety procedures, improper maintenance, inadequate training, and wrongful death. They sought substantial damages, not just for the loss of Tyre's life but for the pain and suffering he experienced during the fall and the trauma inflicted on his family. The legal theories were strong. This wasn't an unforeseeable accident or an inherent risk of a properly operating ride. This was a preventable death caused by deliberate modification of safety systems and systematic failure to follow basic safety procedures. Criminal investigations proceeded in parallel. Prosecutors examined whether the facts supported criminal charges such as manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide. The threshold for criminal charges is higher than for civil liability, requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt that someone's actions or negligence directly caused death, and that the conduct was sufficiently reckless or negligent to warrant criminal sanction. The modified sensors provided strong evidence of intentional misconduct, but investigators needed to establish who had made the modifications and whether they understood the deadly risk they were creating. Operator negligence on the night of the incident was clear, but prosecutors needed to determine if that negligence rose to criminal levels or was simply civil negligence. The broader amusement ride industry watched the Orlando FreeFall case with intense concern. The incident highlighted vulnerabilities in the regulatory framework governing amusement rides. In Florida, as in many states, amusement ride regulation is relatively light compared to other high-risk industries. Annual inspections are required, but day-to-day operations are largely self-regulated by operators. There is no requirement for continuous oversight or independent safety auditing. The system relies heavily on operators following manufacturer specifications and industry best practices voluntarily. When operators cut corners or deliberately violate safety requirements, there are few mechanisms to detect the problems before someone gets hurt. The video footage of Tyre's fall spread across social media despite efforts to remove it, becoming one of those traumatic viral videos that people watch with horrified fascination.
The footage is difficult to watch, showing a teenager falling to his death while others scream. For Tyre's family, the viral spread of the video added another layer of trauma. Their son's death became public spectacle, viewed millions of times by strangers. They had to contend not only with their grief but with the knowledge that the worst moment of their lives and their son's death was being watched and discussed by people around the world. The psychological impact on other riders who were on the freefall with Tyre that night was severe and lasting. They had been on the ride for what should have been a fun thrill, but instead witnessed a teenager fall to his death. Some had been sitting next to him, heard his concerns, seen him slip from his restraint. The trauma manifested in various ways, including nightmares, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and in some cases an inability to participate in normal activities without experiencing panic attacks. Some required ongoing psychological counseling. The experience marked them permanently, associating what should have been entertainment with horror and death. The operators working that night also faced profound psychological consequences along with potential criminal and civil liability. They had been responsible for safety, had dismissed a rider's concerns, had allowed someone to board who exceeded weight limits, had failed to properly verify restraints, and as a result a 14-year-old boy had died. That knowledge is not something that counseling or time can fully resolve. Some operators involved reportedly required mental health treatment for depression and trauma related to the incident. Their careers in the amusement industry were effectively over, as were their reputations in their communities. Icon Park management faced difficult decisions about the future of the complex. The Orlando FreeFall and Slingshot, the two signature thrill rides that had been major draws, were indefinitely closed and in fact would never operate again. In September 2023, about 18 months after the incident, Icon Park announced that both rides would be permanently dismantled and removed. The dismantling of the 430-foot freefall tower was a complex operation, requiring careful planning and execution. The tower was dismantled section by section over several weeks, each piece of the structure that had been part of Tyre's death being cut apart and hauled away. For Tyre's family, the dismantling provided some measure of closure, knowing that the machine that killed their son would never endanger anyone else.
The settlements and judgments that emerged from the lawsuits were substantial but confidential. The Slingshot Group reached settlements with Tyre's family under terms that were not publicly disclosed, but reportedly involved millions of dollars in compensation. Icon Park also reached settlements. The manufacturer Funtime's role was more complicated, as they maintained that their ride was safe when operated according to specifications, and that the modifications and operational negligence were the responsibility of the operators. Ultimately, various parties contributed to settlement funds, distributing liability among those involved. For Tyre's family, no amount of money could replace their son, but the financial compensation at least ensured they wouldn't face financial hardship in addition to their grief, and provided resources for counseling and support. The regulatory response in Florida was measured but meaningful. The Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, facing criticism for inadequate oversight, implemented new requirements for amusement ride operations. Operators were required to implement more rigorous documentation of modifications to rides, with any modification to safety systems requiring manufacturer approval and state review. Weight limit enforcement became mandatory, with requirements for scales and procedures to verify that riders comply with restrictions. Operator training requirements were enhanced, with specific protocols for responding to rider safety concerns. The changes didn't transform Florida into a heavily regulated environment for amusement rides, but they did address some of the most egregious gaps that the Orlando FreeFall incident had exposed. Other states reviewed their own amusement ride safety regulations in light of the Orlando FreeFall disaster. Some implemented similar reforms to Florida's. Industry associations issued updated best practice guidelines, emphasizing the critical importance of following manufacturer specifications, properly maintaining safety systems, and never modifying safety-critical components without manufacturer approval. Insurance companies, which underwrite liability policies for amusement parks and ride operators, increased scrutiny of safety practices, and in some cases required independent safety audits as conditions of coverage. The long-term impact on Orlando's tourism industry was minimal. While the incident generated negative publicity and raised concerns about safety, Orlando's massive tourism infrastructure absorbed the impact without significant effect on overall visitor numbers. Icon Park itself continues operating with its remaining attractions. The loss of the freefall and slingshot removed two attractions but didn't fundamentally change the complex's viability. For individual visitors who had been considering visiting Orlando, some may have reconsidered or chosen to avoid thrill rides, but the broader tourism economy continued largely unchanged. For the community that knew Tyre personally, the loss was profound and permanent. Tyre's football team dedicated their next season to his memory. His high school held memorial services. His coaches and teammates struggled with grief and guilt, wondering if there was something they should have done differently, though rationally they understood that they bore no responsibility for operator negligence and compromised safety systems. The trip that was supposed to be a reward and celebration became a tragedy that marked everyone involved. The broader conversation about amusement ride safety that the incident prompted was valuable but also revealed difficult tensions. Amusement rides are inherently somewhat risky. The thrill comes from experiencing forces and sensations that feel dangerous even when they're carefully controlled. People accept some level of risk when they board a roller coaster or drop tower, understanding that while the ride is designed to be safe, there's always some possibility of mechanical failure or accident. The question is where to draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable risk, and how much regulation is appropriate to minimize risk without eliminating the activities entirely. The Orlando FreeFall incident was notable because it didn't involve an unforeseeable mechanical failure or an inherent risk of the activity. This was preventable through adherence to basic safety practices. The sensors should not have been modified. The weight limit should have been enforced. The operators should have responded to rider concerns. The restraint should have been manually verified. At every stage there were opportunities to prevent the tragedy, and at every stage those opportunities were missed or deliberately ignored. This wasn't bad luck or an unfortunate accident. It was negligence compounded by more negligence, with a 14-year-old boy paying the ultimate price. The Memorial Scholarship Fund established in Tyre's name helped channel grief into something positive. The fund provides scholarships for young athletes, particularly those who, like Tyre, might not otherwise have resources for educational opportunities. It keeps his memory alive in a constructive way and ensures that some good emerges from the tragedy. Tyre's family has spoken publicly about their son, sharing memories of his personality, his love of football, his kindness to others, his dreams for the future. They've worked to ensure he's remembered as more than just a victim of an amusement ride accident, but as a whole person with potential that was senselessly destroyed. The questions that haunt everyone involved are the what-ifs. What if the sensors hadn't been modified? What if operators had enforced the weight limit? What if they had listened when Tyre expressed concerns? What if they had manually checked his restraint? What if there had been better oversight and regulation? Each decision point was an opportunity to save a life, and each was missed. The cumulative effect of those failures was death that should never have happened. The Orlando FreeFall disaster stands as a case study in how organizational negligence, cost-cutting, and failure to follow basic safety protocols can kill. The modifications to safety systems, the failure to enforce weight limits, the dismissal of rider concerns, the inadequate training, the poor oversight, all combined to create conditions where tragedy became not just possible but probable. Tyre Sampson was unlucky in being the person for whom all the failures converged at once, but the systemic problems meant that if it hadn't been him, it likely would have been someone else eventually. The lesson, if there is one, is that safety cannot be compromised for convenience or profit. Weight limits exist for reasons, sensor settings are specified by manufacturers for reasons. Training and procedures exist for reasons. When those safeguards are ignored or deliberately circumvented, the results can be fatal. The few dollars saved by allowing riders who exceed limits to board, the time saved by not properly verifying restraints, the hassle avoided by not installing and using scales, all of those minor operational efficiencies came at the cost of a 14-year-old's life. Today the site where the Orlando FreeFall once stood is empty, the tower dismantled, the ride removed from existence. The space serves as an unmarked memorial to what happened there, to the failure of basic safety practices, and the deadly consequences that followed. For those who know the history, walking through Icon Park and seeing that empty space evokes memories of a preventable tragedy. For visitors unaware of the history, it's just an empty lot awaiting future development. Tyre Sampson went to Orlando expecting to have fun, to experience thrills, to make memories with his teammates. He should have come home with stories about the rides, photos with friends, and anticipation for future adventures. Instead, he came home in a casket, killed by negligence that was as preventable as it was deadly. His death changed amusement ride safety practices, prompted regulatory reforms, and reminded an entire industry that cutting corners on safety has consequences. But those improvements, important as they are, don't bring back a 14-year-old boy who should still be alive, playing football, planning his future, and living the life that was stolen from him by failures that should never have occurred.